Okay, good evening everybody. Thanks for joining us here. I'm going to be talking tonight about smart money, things that they should have taught us in high school, but unfortunately they probably did not. Just a little introduction about myself. Back in 1988, when I was 16 years old, my dad gave me a book called The Wealthy Barber by David Chilton. And I read that book and it sparked a lifelong interest in personal finances and investments. It's an area I'm quite passionate about. I spend a lot of my personal time continuing to educate myself in this field. I've learned a lot over the last 32 years. I've gone through stages in life: teenager, student, a young adult, a working person, a husband. I had a divorce in the early 2000s. A few years later, I became a husband again. I have an amazing wife now, and we've also got 3 awesome kids, so I'm a dad as well. My investing history includes investing in Canada savings bonds, mutual funds. I hired my own financial advisor at one point. I let him go and decided to pick stocks on my own following that. And more recently, I've moved all of my investments into ETFs, or equity traded funds. Basically, there's a lot of research literature that's come out lately that's shed a lot more light on investing and finances, and it's quite interesting. The field is changing rapidly, so I want to share some of those things and some basic premises with you tonight. Okay, so let's get started. Just a conflict of interest disclaimer first. I'm not a financial professional. I have no conflict of interest to declare. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm not making money from this presentation. This talk will involve both evidence-based and practical financial advice, but ultimately you are solely responsible for your money, not me. Here's our outline for tonight. I'll paint a picture of Canadians' general financial health, and then here are the highlights of what they should have taught us in high school, but most likely didn't. Hopefully we'll have fun, we'll learn some new things. I think there's something here for everybody, both people who are very new to finances and the experienced investor. And I'm also very happy to answer questions either at the end of the presentation or contact me via email or text or chat. I'm always happy to discuss anything that I've talked about tonight. Okay, Canadians' financial health. The average salary in British Columbia last year was a little over $53,000 per person, and it had increased from the year before, which is fantastic. But let's look at this table. Let's look at average debt per person, and this is non-mortgage debt, so this does not count mortgages. This is other types of debt. We can see that debt tends to peak around the mid-40s and into our early 50s at about $36,000 per person. And the other interesting thing to note is that at 65 and above, Canadians on average still have significant non-mortgage debt, a little over $16,000 for the average retiree. The government did a huge financial survey a couple of years ago called the Canadian Financial Capability Survey, and they do that every 5 years. So let's look at some of the results from that recent survey. Almost 3/4 of Canadians have some type of outstanding debt or have used a payday loan in the 12 months prior. 31% of those folks believe that they had too much debt. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, because that leaves about 40% of Canadians that this would indicate feel comfortable with maintaining some sort of debt. This can be a problem. It's a tough battle sometimes to control debt because our society is so focused on consumerism, the ads we see, a lot of the people we talk to. That sort of thinking, though, however, will not lead us to be financially wealthy or well as we age. The types of debt that these folks carry, balances on credit cards, vehicles, personal lines of credit, and student loans. 8% of Canadians said that they were falling behind on their bills and other financial commitments. That had gone up significantly from the 5 years earlier. 17% said that their monthly spending exceeded their monthly income. And over 40% of senior households had debt. About half of those had mortgage debt, and the other half had those other types of debts that I had mentioned. So overall, a lot of Canadians tend to be in debt, and unfortunately for some, as time goes on and we enter our senior 65+ years, we might be in debt for our entire lives. Let's look at the other side of the coin. Let's talk about the folks who are financially wealthy, the millionaires. A big study was done in the States a few years back, and here's some of the results from that. They surveyed thousands of people who had a net worth of over $1 million, and they found that the vast majority, 90% of them, lived in homes less than $1 million of value. They tended to buy quite regular cars. They rarely spent over $40,000 on a vehicle, and many of them bought used cars. They budgeted, they made very smart purchases when they were needed, and they invested regularly and over the long term. They didn't look like millionaires, as we would think someone who is a millionaire might look like. Those millionaires built their assets up, and they did not carry debt. The method was very simple, but sometimes it's hard to implement. Spend less than you make, and intelligently invest that difference. How about the folks who look like the millionaires that we often think about? Drive the fancy cars, they live in the $1 million homes, they take the big vacations every year, have all the big toys. Those folks tended to not actually be millionaires. In fact, it showed that most of the funding and what they were expensing everything to was into debt. So they had large debt loads as compared to the actual millionaires. So the trick here is to spend like you want to grow rich. And basically that's spend less, invest more, and the personal decisions we make now have big impacts down the road. A $10,000 decision that we make today turns into a $120,000 impact 35 years down the road. I'll explain that just a little bit more. So for example, let's say you have a 30-year-old who wants to buy a pickup truck. He's debating between a $60,000 new truck or maybe one that's a few years old for $40,000. That $20,000 difference in 35 years will be a $240,000 impact on their financial wealth. The trick is, if they decide to go with the $40,000 vehicle, whether that's paid up front or over 5 years, they need to invest the difference. So if he was smart and took the $20,000 and invested it, it'll be almost $250,000 by the time he retires at age 65. So personal financial decisions now have big impacts down the road. Let's get on to our list of what they should have taught us in high school. Also wanted to mention a bit about perspective before we move forward. I realize that in Canada, all of us have different life circumstances surrounding money. It can be a challenging topic for some people to discuss. An example is my wife was raised by a single mom, and they grew up below the poverty line. Paying half of their bills each month was considered a win. So I understand that I'm aware of this reality for many Canadians. And I have two thoughts surrounding that. First of all, there are agencies that can help us create plans and move forward if we find ourselves in that sort of situation or if we're struggling with debt. And secondly, it's my hope that while we're discussing this, we're going to learn something, that hopefully we can pass that on to people around us, family, children, friends. Knowledge is a wonderful gift that we can pass along to hopefully the next generation and those around us. Okay, credit cards. The premise with credit cards ideally is you want to be able to pay your balance in full every month. Don't pay only the minimum. When they say you can pay $10 this month, they're charging you interest on the other $800 that you're carrying on that card. And it's basically highway robbery. Interest rates in Canada are about 19% on average. Some cards are pushing 30%. Now, if you compare that to the Bank of Canada prime rate, there's a huge difference there. So again, the idea, if you want to accumulate assets and not debt, pay off your credit cards every month and try to keep that on track. That should be our number one priority on the road to creating financial wealth for ourselves. Secondly, budgeting. Creating and maintaining a budget is one of the most important first steps in managing our money. On that big survey they did, about half of Canadians report having a budget, and that had gone up a little bit from the 5 years earlier. That's great. And those who budgeted, it was shown, were in fact smarter with their money. In what ways? They were less likely to fall behind on their financial commitments. They were less likely to spend more than their monthly income. They were more likely to keep on top of bill payments and monthly cash flow, and they were more likely to be taking actions to pay off their mortgages and other debts at a faster rate. Budgeting today is quite simple. You can get an app. So there's a list here. There's quite a few very good ones available. Some are free, some are available for a small fee. Get one with a high rating. What this will enable you to do, if you were to track your spending diligently for a couple of months, is you'll get to see where your money is actually going. And you'll probably be surprised how much you might spend on certain discretionary items. Input all your fixed costs. We've all got rent and bills that come in around the same amount every month, but it's the other things that might surprise us. And a lot of times when people do this, they'll self-correct. They'll realize, oh wow, I didn't realize how much I was spending on eating out or buying coffee every day. So that's an interesting little experiment for you to do. One of the big things to think about too is recurring monthly bills. And I think everyone should look at this at least once a year. And what I'm talking about are things like our cell phone bills, our Netflix, our cable, our internet, monthly subscriptions we have, bank fees, anything that's on a monthly payment plan. Oftentimes we hear ourselves complaining about how much internet is, or we're paying monthly for our cell phone. If you call those companies and talk to them and say you're not happy with what you're paying, oftentimes they will drop your monthly bill, and you might save 10 or 20 bucks a month by doing that. Just this past year when I reviewed mine, I changed internet providers. Shaw was going to charge me $92 a month, and I decided to go with another company I'd heard about called Lightspeed. I'm paying 42 bucks a month. I've saved $50 for the exact same service. I updated my cell phone plan by calling them, 15 bucks a month savings there. So even though I do this regularly, I saved another 65 bucks a month. That's almost $800 a year in my pocket. So it's worth looking into that. Let's talk a little bit about insurance. Insurance, the basic premise with insurance is to make sure you're protected from the big life-changing events. You don't want to worry about a baseball flying through your kitchen window. You do want to worry about a tree crashing through the roof of your kitchen. So let's talk about some types of insurances you might need. Life insurance, especially if you have a partner and children, life insurance is probably extremely important. Term life insurance is fairly inexpensive, especially if you're younger and healthier. It's a great way to go to make sure you are insured against a death between either you or your partner. Sometimes our employers provide that, so you want to find out if you have an employer program and how much it covers. The thing to think about with life insurance, have a talk with your partner. What do you want it to cover? A lot of times people want it to cover their mortgage, and they may want it to cover their income, especially if you're the main income earner in the family. So all of a sudden, if you think, I need to cover $50,000 of income for 10 years because we've got kids, my spouse might want to stay home and raise the kids, and we got to cover a $300,000 mortgage, all of a sudden you're looking at an $800,000 life insurance plan. So have that discussion. Home insurance as a homeowner is one that we all should have if we own homes. Renters or contents insurance. A lot of people rent and they assume that their landlord's policy covers their personal belongings. It does not. The landlord should have a policy to cover the building. You need to have your own contents insurance in case there's a flood or a fire and damage to your personal belongings occur. That's fairly inexpensive. For about 45 bucks a month, you can cover everything you own. So look into that if you haven't already. Car insurance, we have to have that in BC. And disability insurance, one that's often overlooked. Disability insurance, if you get injured and are unable to work, this covers your income. So this is one that a lot of people aren't aware is available. You might have it through work, but you need to ask questions and find out. A 30-year-old in Canada has a 4 times greater chance of becoming disabled than dying before 65. So this is one that tends to be used more than we think sometimes. And finally, a will. If you've got a partner or kids, you really should have a will. It's very easy to do nowadays. I use a website called willful.co, and for a couple $100 you can create a legally binding will for you and your partner. If you have a very complicated financial situation, you probably should consult a lawyer. That would typically run you about $1,000, but you may want to make sure all your bases are covered if you have a complicated scenario. Some insurances you probably do not need. Cash value or investment types of life insurance. Sometimes it goes by the name of whole life, universal life, or variable life. They tend to be very, very expensive when you compare it to term life insurance. My rule of thumb is use life insurance or use insurance as insurance. Keep your investments as your investments. Don't buy the combination products. Consumer insurance. So when you go buy something at the store, they often ask if you want the extended warranty. Think about it. the house always wins on that one. Otherwise, they wouldn't offer it to you or they would charge you more. So I tend to decline that 95% of the time. And over the years, it's worked out significantly in my favor. Another thing to keep in mind, sometimes with credit cards, you can get a credit card that extends or doubles your manufacturer's warranty. That's a really nice feature to have. So if you buy something with a 1-year warranty, your credit card will, in essence, double it to a 2-year. I've made use of that in the past, so that's a nice feature. Mortgage insurance that the bank offers. In case one of you dies and you're taking out a mortgage, it's very expensive. And the other thing too is as you go along and pay your principal down on your mortgage, the insurance that it's covering is a lot less. So I would avoid that one. Look at term life insurance to cover those big events. Critical illness insurance tends to be extremely expensive and sometimes very limited in the situations it covers. For example, a 40-year-old non-smoker would pay about $2,000 a year for a $200,000 critical illness policy. So it's very expensive. You may not need that one. Lower deductibles. To have a very low deductible on your car or home insurance increases your insurance rates. If you have a higher deductible, you will often drop what you're paying. So next time you're renewing your home insurance or your car insurance, have a chat with your agent. It only takes them a minute to punch in some numbers and ask them, hey, if I change my deductible from $300 to $1,000, how much money would I save? That might be a nice way to save some significant money. Okay, let's talk a little bit about buying a home versus renting a home. I'll put out a challenge here. In Canada, we tend to think of our homes as a big retirement wealth builder. I'm going to challenge us to think differently. I'd like us to think of our homes as something we use as a consumer item. It helps us with our life, we enjoy it, but not as a major pillar of your financial wealth. Most older Canadians actually continue to live in their family home into their retirement years. So suddenly, if you do that, the value or the dollar value built up in your home is not easily accessible. We've been conditioned in Canada to think about owning a home means you're really an adult now. Be careful with that line of thought, and I'll explain why as we go along. And with buying a home, it's probably the most board against financial decision you'll make in your life. Don't rush it. Try and be sensible about it. You want to be financially ready when you make that step. What do I mean by that? You want to have saved up a 20% down payment and have a little extra. If you go all in on a home and you end up with $100 left in your bank, you're going to feel a lot of stress when the hot water tank bursts or a raccoon gets into your attic. There's a lot of often unexpected costs, especially in the first year of owning a home, that first-time home buyers may not be aware of. Renting. I'll talk a little bit about renting. Home ownership typically is about 1.5 to 2 times the cost of renting. Renting can actually make you wealthy if you're strategic about it. And in fact, if you look at the numbers over the course of 10 or more years, you can be on par as compared to someone who owns a home if you're smart with your money. You aren't throwing your money away. I hear that a lot about people who are renting and they're feeling frustrated. If you're, again, strategic, you're not throwing your money away. So here's some of the pros about renting. There's less commitment on your part. You have predictable and lower costs as compared to home ownership. And overall, it's a lower risk approach. The key with this is that if you want to be as wealthy as a homeowner, you need to invest the rent versus owning difference. So whatever the owner would typically pay on a monthly basis, your rent's much less than that. You need to invest that difference wisely. If you want more information on that, the reference at the bottom of the screen has a great paper describing how that can be put into practice. And if you're renting, keep in mind, when you buy a home, there's a lot of costs that people don't anticipate that are ongoing. So what makes owning more expensive? There's property taxes, there's maintenance costs, and there's higher insurance costs. Those are just a few. Okay, point 5, savings and pension plans. What does retirement in Canada look like without saving up for it? On average, when people get to be about 65 years old, they can start drawing their Canada pension plan, old age security, and sometimes a guaranteed income supplement. That averages out to about $2,150 a month for Canadians. That's a little less than $26,000 a year. And another thing to keep in mind is about 17% of Canadians over 65 still have a mortgage, and 40% still have some sort of debt. So all of a sudden, $26,000 a year doesn't go that far. It's not a great looking scenario if you haven't saved up for your retirement. But what about my pension, you might ask? Well, if you have a pension, that's fantastic and extremely valuable. Unfortunately, pensions are declining quickly in Canada. Only 37% of Canadians currently are covered by some type of pension plan through their employment. And this is declining year by year. Most of those pension plans are in the public sector. So if you work for a municipal government, a provincial government, or a federal government, about 90% of those folks are covered with some sort of pension plan. Moving to the much larger private sector, less than a quarter of those employees have a pension plan. Pensions, as I mentioned, are extremely valuable. Hold on to them. You may want to inquire also about voluntary contributions to your pension plan. If you've got a good one in place, often you're able to contribute more every paycheck, and they will put that away for you as part of your pension growth. Look into that. That's a great option. Usually people, if they add another $100 every paycheck, you end up not missing it, but it can have a big, wonderful impact on you when you move into retirement. So ultimately, pensions are disappearing, which means 63% of us currently need to create our own pension if we want more than what the government will give us when we retire. How do we do that? We need to save money. We need to invest it intelligently. I realize, again, this is not always possible with life circumstances or different seasons that we go through in life, but hopefully you can make it a goal. Ideally, if you could save 10 or 20% of your income each month, you'll do amazingly well. Even 10% over your average earning career, you'll have a wonderful nest egg by the time you retire. The trick with this is to pay yourself first. If you wait to see how much money is left in your bank account at the end of the month, for most of us, the answer is going to be zero. So the idea is to take that money as soon as the paycheck comes in and put it into your investment account. Once you start, your financial stress will tend to be reduced, and you want to invest your money based on the evidence. And I'll tell you what that is in a little while. Our sixth point, you may have heard about the magic of compounding interest or the magic of compounding gains. It's quite simple to be a millionaire, but it's not easy to do. It does take discipline. It does take commitment over the long term. Your greatest investment ally is time. Ideally, the best time to start investing was when you were 16 or the day you were born. For most of us, that doesn't happen. So the next best time to start is now, in the present. You want to contribute monthly, and once you get going, literally, you can manage your own investment portfolio in less than an hour a year. With what's available and the technology out there today, it's extremely simple to do. I'm going to tell you a little story about two ladies who are trying to save up for their retirement plan. So one of the girls is named Star, and Star is 5 years old, and she grows up on a tropical island with her mom. And her mom decides that she wants Star to learn about good old-fashioned work, about being a good environmental steward, and to learn about investing. So they start collecting cans on the beach. And they collect enough cans every month that they earn about $45 in refunds. So Star's mom, who's a smart lady, starts to invest it in a US stock market ETF, an equity traded fund. That averages about a 9% a year return, which is the historical average of that market over the last 90 years. This continues throughout Star's youth, her teen years, until she finally moves back to the United States, where her mom was originally from, and she goes to New York City and goes to school and starts to work. Fast forward in time 20 years. Star is now 25 years old. She's no longer collecting cans, but her mom continues to say, Star, you need to e-transfer me $45 a month, and I'll keep putting that away for you. Star does it. In the meantime, Star becomes best friend with a girl named Lucy. Lucy is an investment banker. She drives a nice BMW. She eats out at gourmet restaurants. She spends the rest of her income on clothes, theater shows, expensive shoes, and fancy vacations. Once both ladies turn 40, Lucy decides she better start saving up for retirement. So she starts a pretty aggressive investment plan. She decides she's going to put $800 a month away for 25 years. and she invested in the same ETF that Star is investing in. In the meantime, Star's continuing, chugging along, 45 bucks a month into her investments. Lucy, in fact, even gets on Star's case and says, you better start putting more than $45 a month away. That's not very much. Star doesn't want to brag, but she feels, I better set Lucy straight. And she says to her, Lucy, you're the one who's actually in financial trouble. You're going to need to put more than 800 bucks a month away if you want to catch up with me by the time we retire. Unfortunately for Lucy, she laughs this off instead of going online to have a look at a compound interest calculator. So now both ladies are 65. Over the course of their investing timeline, some years went up, some years their financial investments went down, but they averaged about 9%. So 65, they retire, they decide we're going to Mexico for a week, we're going to celebrate, and they sit down for dinner the first night, and Star says to Lucy, well, did you save more than the $800 a month I recommended? Lucy laughs again and replies, this is coming from you who only put $45 a month away? Ha! Let's see how they did. Who's ahead at age 65? Well, Star ends up with over $1 million. So she's invested $45 a month for 60 years, only $32,400 out of her pocket. It's grown to over $1 million. Lucy, who did the aggressive $800 a month, she spent $240,000 investing, ends up with $813,000. Star was right. She ended up ahead. This is the magic of compounding gains. So let's look at this visually. So what you want to look at here with Star, who started at 5 years old, $45 a month, is once she got a few decades in, her graph, her investment gains started growing extremely rapidly. Most of that growth came in the last 3 decades of her investment timeline, over $1 million. Let's take a peek at Lucy's account, 800 bucks a month, so she put a lot more away, but again, she didn't have enough time on her side. It started to ramp up near the end, but by the time she was 65, boy, if she had started even 10 years earlier, she would have been in much better shape. Now, she's still in fantastic shape because she's got $800,000 in her retirement portfolio, but the $45 over the long term beat out Lucy's $800 a month. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about taxes and how you can avoid them. There's a lot of great ways in Canada to save on taxes or delay paying taxes or avoid paying taxes. These are all legal, by the way. The number one way to do this is through what are called registered accounts. You've probably heard of some of these accounts, your RRSP or a registered retirement savings plan. Basically, when you put money away into your RRSP, you are delaying paying taxes on that until sometime in the future when you take that money out. So the money you put in, we call those pre-tax dollars. You make a contribution, you do not have to pay taxes on that money or the growth of that money until you withdraw it, ideally once you're retired. There's another amazing account in Canada, the tax-free savings account that opened up about 12 years ago. This money you put in post-tax dollars. So what you're putting in here, you've already paid taxes on. The tax-free savings account, you never have to pay taxes on the money you put in or the growth that occurs. So if you have a TFSA that grows to be $500,000 in your retirement, you never have to pay another cent of taxes on that. This is an amazing investment vehicle. Unfortunately, a lot of Canadians do not take advantage of it. It's also a misnomer. I wish they had called it the tax-free investment account, because a lot of Canadians use it to save up money for their next trip or to put new laminate flooring in their house. That's not what it was intended for. It was intended to invest over the long term for your retirement. A tip for those of you that have a TFSA and also have a common law partner or a spouse, you've probably named your spouse as a beneficiary to that account. There's another designation that you should have your spouse or partner labeled as. It's called a successor holder. And there's a significant difference here. If I've named Sarah my beneficiary on my TFSA, when I die, my account gets closed, she gets all the money, tax-free, but that's it. But I've actually named her as a successor holder. So what happens when I die is that Sarah will actually get my whole TFSA and it will stay open. So she now will have 2 TFSA accounts, hers and mine. And the beauty of this is that my money, now hers, can continue to grow tax-free for as long as she wants. So doing the successor holder is a huge difference. It allows your partner to have 2 accounts open and 2 accounts grow indefinitely with no tax implications. So check into that for those of you that have a TFSA. Finally, the third most popular registered account, the RESP, the Registered Education Savings Plan. The government's designed this to help us save up a little bit for our kids' education down the road. You're allowed to contribute $2,500 a year to this, and the government will match 20% of that. $500 worth, they'll top up your account with that. Great way to get some money back from the government and save up for your kids' education. Just a word about all 3 of these accounts. These are labels. They are umbrella names for accounts. Once you put money into one of these accounts, you can open these up through your banking institution or through low-cost online brokerages. You can do whatever you want with the money. You could deposit money into your RSP and you could leave it as cash. You could buy GICs, you could buy bonds, you could invest it in stocks, index funds, ETFs. It's up to you what you do with the money. These are just labels for those accounts. And we'll talk a little bit more about those different strategies in a moment. So what do you want to invest your money in? There's 4 main types of assets or investment classes. The first one is keeping your money in cash. By far, it's the safest way to invest, but I don't know that I'd actually call it investing because it's the lowest return on your money. You might get anywhere between 0 and 1.5% interest on your cash, depending on what your bank account is paying you. But presently, that's lower than inflation. So in fact, if you leave money in cash, you're losing buying power with your money over time. Cash is great for a 3 to 6 month emergency fund, but not a high return investment. Secondly, we have bonds or GICs, guaranteed investment certificates. These are very low risk, but they're also lower returning on your money. Think of these as a loan. So you're loaning your money to either the government or a bank or a large company, and they will give you a guaranteed % return on the money you're loaning them. So let's say you go buy a GIC and you put in $100. The bank promises to give you 1.5% return on your money. So you lock your $100 in for 1 year, for example. At the end of the year, you get your $100 back and another $1.50 of interest payment. If you're under the age of 45, there are not really a lot of good reasons why you should hold any bonds or GICs in your investment accounts. Oh, another note is bonds or GICs are often referred to collectively as fixed income. So you'll see that term come up. Thirdly, stocks and various types of funds, index funds, equity traded funds, also known as equities. These are higher risk, but they also offer much higher returns. When you buy a stock in a company, you actually own a portion of that company. So let's say you buy some shares in McDonald's or TD Bank. These are publicly owned companies. Tens of thousands or millions of individuals own portions or shares of these companies, and these shares are bought and sold on a stock exchange, which is similar to an auction house. If you own a share, you have real ownership of the assets and the profits of these companies. Owning a slice of a business is a great way to grow your money, but there's no guarantees on 1 or 2 or only a few stocks. One of the big rules is you do not want to put all your eggs into one basket. It's better to own many different companies. That way you won't lose much money if one of them gets into trouble or goes bankrupt. The fourth category is real estate, and we touched on that earlier, so we won't go into that much more now. The younger you are, the longer your investment timeline is. And the younger you are, it also means you can take a little more risk, and you should therefore be more invested into stocks or what we call equities. As you get older, you don't want to take on as much risk in your portfolio. So we tend to start moving into more bonds or those fixed income investments at an appropriate ratio. Let's take a look at the last 200 years on what these various investment classes have done. These are what we call real returns. This takes into consideration what inflation has done to our money over the last 200 years as well. So let's say in 1802, your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather took a dollar, a single dollar, and invested it in something. How would that look today? Well, if he buried his dollar in your backyard and you dug it up, that dollar would be worth about a nickel. That's what happens over time. Inflation eats away at our buying power if we keep things in cash. If your great-great-great-great-grandfather had put or bought $1 of gold, it would be worth about $3.21 nowadays. Again, not very good. If he had bought some GICs, or guaranteed investment certificates, this is called bills on here, or T-bills. It's an American graph, my apologies for that. But if he had bought GICs, your $1 would be worth about $278. What if he had bought some bonds? This has done significantly better. The real return on bonds has been about 3.5% a year over the last 200 years. The $1 would be worth about $1,500. What if he had took a dollar and bought stocks in the stock market? On average, over the last 200 years, the stock markets have returned 6.7%. It would be worth $930,000 today. So by far, if your great-great-great-great-great-granddad had bought $1 in stocks, that was the winning strategy. Now, the other thing to note that I need to point out to you is stock markets are volatile. You can see that as you look along the graph as the decades go by, there are sometimes pretty wild swings up and down. That's normal. When you look at the stock markets, you want to take a big picture approach. And the point here is when you look at 1802 to present day, the markets have gone up. There can be wild fluctuations over the short term, and short term can mean 1, 2, or 5 years. But if you look at 10-year windows, the world stock markets have always historically gone up. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, stocks versus mutual funds versus index funds or ETFs, equity traded funds. Let's define these a little bit and I'll tell you a little story. So you happen to move to a new town and it's got some great businesses in that town you're now living, and you decide, I'm going to save and invest for my retirement. In theory, your best bet would be to put all your money into the one company that will grow the most in time. But in reality, it's very hard to know which company that will be ahead of time. So a stock, as we mentioned earlier, is buying a piece of a company. So let's say you decide to buy shares in Shaw. So you put all your money into Shaw and you buy stock shares in that company. What happens your first year? Well, Shaw does okay as a company and their share price increases 5%. That's not bad. So you've increased your net wealth by 5%. But meanwhile, the medical clinic down the street has actually increased in value 23% that year. That's typical of owning only one or a few stocks. You tend to miss out on the big winners. Picking the best stocks ahead of time is extremely difficult. But you're smarter than that. You heard somewhere that you shouldn't put all your eggs into one basket, so you decide to spread your savings and investments a little more broadly. You have a couple more options. So the next one is mutual funds. A mutual fund, or an actively managed fund, is a fund that owns portions of multiple companies. So let's say you go to your local bank and you decide to give your money to Freddie, the financial advisor that you meet there. He will invest your money into multiple companies that he thinks will do the best. So he decides that Apple, Royal Bank, and Bob's Clothing are your best bets. None of your monies goes into Carla's Cafe, the medical clinic, or Shaw. Now, if he chooses correctly, you could earn a very high return. But if he gets it wrong, you'll probably do worse than the average. Mutual funds sound smart up front, but as a group, they tend to perform poorly. Lots of people work for the mutual fund companies, and they are called actively managed funds. There are people who try to pick the best stocks to put into these mutual funds, and they charge you a fee for this. Typically in Canada, it's between 1.5% and 2.5% that you will pay every year, no matter how the fund does, to own that fund. And here's another big thing. In Canada, when these fees are considered, the research has consistently shown over 3, 5, and 10 years, only 10% of mutual funds in Canada outperform the average stock market return. So think about that. Only 10% do better than average. So if you have any mutual funds in any of your investment portfolios, the investment poses the question to you, why? Because 9 times out of 10, it will perform worse than the average. Okay, so here's your scenario. You buy the mutual fund from Freddie at the bank. It makes 7%. That's not bad, but actually it's not 7% because they're going to charge you 2% off the top. So in reality, you've only earned 5% on your mutual fund return. Apple did great, Royal Bank did well, but unfortunately, Bob's Clothing went bankrupt. Nobody saw it coming. By the way, I forgot to mention, Carla's Cafe got bought out by Starbucks. Their value went up 50% in the past year. But unfortunately, you missed out because Freddie didn't put Carla into your mutual fund. He picked the wrong businesses. They weren't all the winning ones. Okay, so how can we solve that problem? We'll move into what's called ETFs, or index funds. There is a slight difference between the two, but for our purposes, we'll keep them together. So what an index fund does is it will spread your money over all of the companies or many more companies than a mutual fund typically will. They don't try and pick the winners. They just buy the whole market. It's known as passive investing because of this. No one needs to think or do homework and try to anticipate which companies will perform the best because you will own a portion of them all. And it's representatively proportionate. Apple is a huge company. Bob's Clothing is very small. So you will be investing more of your money proportionately in Apple as compared to Bob's. So it's a nice distribution that's evenly spread out. You own a piece of everything. There's 2 major advantages to this. ETFs spread your money across thousands of companies. So if a single or a few companies get into trouble or go bankrupt, it's not a big deal. The impact is not as great. And keep in mind, when you're buying the whole stock market, what do markets do over the long term, 10 or more years? They go up. That's what history teaches us again and again and again. The second nice thing is they are very simple. You buy and sell them like a stock. So if you have an investment or a registered account open, it's easy to go online, type in the ticker symbol for it and click purchase. And then suddenly you own thousands of companies. They also have very low fees. Instead of 2%, it's usually 0.2 to 0.05, extremely low fees. And again, the research shows that the index funds, they will beat out the mutual funds 90% of the time. They're a great investment for both beginners and experienced investors alike. So here's our scenario. You decide to buy an index fund and own a little bit of everything in the town you move into. You have a great year. The companies average out a return of 12%. You pay your 0.2%, so you've made 11.8% return through your index fund. The biggest winner was Starbucks bought out Carla's. It doubled Carla's value. You benefited from that. You hit a home run. Bob's Clothing went bankrupt, but you weren't affected as much because you were distributed across your index fund. Overall, you had a great year and you outperformed both the index fund and individual stocks. That's typical of these investment avenues. Okay, I'll review why index funds or ETFs are better than mutual funds or individual stocks. Stocks are very high risk and your returns tend to be volatile. They can change quite largely year over year. And again, the studies have consistently demonstrated even the professionals in the field cannot consistently and repeatedly pick winning stocks over time. People can get lucky, but it's very rare to have someone demonstrate skill over 10 years or more in picking winning stocks. In fact, there's been a lot of studies where they'll compare professional stock pickers to a monkey or throwing darts onto a list of stocks. And more often than not, the monkey and the darts perform better over the long run. Over the last 30 years, only 1.3% of the world's stocks have accounted for all of the market increases over the value of what a GIC would have given you. Chances are, if you're trying to pick the winning stocks, you will miss the 1.3% that account for the vast majority of all the gains. You could get lucky, but the argument I'm trying to make is that if you want to be a smart, evidence-based investor, you don't want to rely on luck, you want to rely on the evidence. So, the take-home lesson, don't buy individual stocks. Too high risk, don't rely on luck. Mutual funds. We talked about those. They invest in multiple companies, but not all of the companies. They are medium to high risk, and they usually provide medium returns. They are actively managed, so they charge fairly high fees, between 1.5% and 2.5%. And there's a little bit of a secret in Canada, and I've already mentioned it. Less than 10% of the mutual funds will beat the stock market average. That's actually quite horrible, especially considering that when you walk into a bank, that's the first thing they're going to suggest you invest in. Less than 10% beat the stock market average. Let that sink in for a moment. A lot of times, what happens when you go in and talk to the nice lady at the bank, you get a lot of smoke and mirror salesmanship. And what I mean by that is that when they're selling you mutual funds, they have a conflict of interest. They're making money off of what you buy. Mutual fund companies are notorious for showing you the 10% that have beaten the market averages over the last 3, 5, or 10 years. That's what they put in all of their promotional materials. Please don't be fooled by that. It's very easy in hindsight to look back in time and cherry pick the best mutual funds. That's what they show you. But when you look at the details on each of those, there's always a little disclaimer that says, rightfully so, past performance is not indicative of future performance. They know that they cannot guarantee you those returns, and in fact, 90% of the time, they will underperform that average stock market return. So, there's a saying within the industry that's quite revealing as well, and it goes like this: you don't buy mutual funds, you are sold mutual funds. So please have your eyes open to that. Okay, index funds, ETFs, why are they better? They're medium risk, but they are the highest returns when you look at long-term investing, 10 years or more. Index investing provides the highest statistical evidence-based chance of success when you compare it with individual stocks or actively managed mutual funds. They have very low fees, which contributes to how good they perform, and they are passively managed. You're buying and owning a little bit of thousands of companies. So you want to be diversified, own all those companies. Smart investors do that, and they end up owning that 1.3% of stocks that make a difference. The evidence shows over the long term, ETFs win. They're broadly diversified, they have low fees, and they're the smartest way to invest our money based on all the research coming out. I mentioned fees a little bit. Do they really matter? Canada, unfortunately for us, has some of the highest mutual fund fees in the world. These are called management expense ratios. They will always have what the management expense ratio is when you look at the fact sheet for a certain mutual fund. And we average a little over 2% here in Canada. So no matter how your mutual fund performs, year in and year out, the bank always gets their 2%. But is 2% really a big deal? Doesn't sound like a lot. It's 2%, right? Plus, you might think, or they'll tell you at the bank, you're paying that 2%, but you're getting a professional person to actively manage and monitor your mutual funds. Well, let's see what the impact of fees are. So here's another scenario. Somehow you come across an inheritance or a lump sum, maybe you win a lottery of $100,000. You decide to invest this for 25 years, and you earn an average of 7% a year, which is what global stock markets have averaged over our lifetimes. The fee on an ETF is 0.2%. Here's how your portfolio has done. So what you want to look at here is the orange line is the total return on your money, and you can see that over 25 years, you've gained $442,000, but you do pay that 0.2% in fees. That ends up being almost $25,000 over time. The total value of your portfolio, the money you put in and your gains, a little over $500,000. Not bad. Let's use the exact same scenario, and instead you'll take your $100,000 and put it into a mutual fund that charges 2.2%. Again, the orange line shows you what your money has done, but the yellow line shows you what your money actually does because the bank takes their fees. How much fees does 2.2% equate to over 25 years? Almost $220,000. The first time I ever saw a graph like this, my jaw hit the floor. 2.2% over 25 years ends up being half of your gains. Instead of walking away with over $500,000, your mutual fund lets you walk away with $322,000. So the take-home lesson, you've paid $195,000 more in fees over 25 years. Fees matter, and they matter a lot. Okay, so what do you do if you want to be an evidence-based smart investor? You want to own a little bit of every company in the entire world. This is a graph showing us the last 50 years of how all the stock markets in the world have done. Now, you can see some very significant events over time here. Some of the more recent ones, in the late 90s, we had what was called the dot-com bubble. Technology stocks rose very rapidly in value, and then the bubble burst, and they came crashing back down to reality. So we see a huge drop in the couple of years after that. But of course, we've already talked about this, over long-term stock markets increase. Things rebounded, as they always have, but then we hit what was called the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Again, a huge drop in markets, about 50%. Yet again, though, markets recovered from that and moved along. And most recently, this past spring, we had what's called the COVID crash. Markets dropped a little over 30% over the course of 3 weeks. That was very rapid. But look at our red line again. What do stock markets do when we look at 10-year windows or longer? They increase in value. That's what history has taught us, and that's been consistent over time. Now, a word of warning, of course, if you look at short-term returns, stock markets can drop by 50%. Sometimes they can go up 40% in a year. But the average over the long term is 7% a year, which is a solid return on your money. So another key take-home, please look at this in 10-year or more windows, not over the short term. A lot of times, investor emotion hinders us as well and causes us to lose money. I think what people are fearful of most is the stock markets around the world becoming significantly depressed or crashing and then staying depressed for a very long time. This happened about 90 years ago in the Great Depression, and it hasn't happened since. Recovery has always been quicker over the last 90 years. Back in 2007, 2008, government stepped in fairly quickly. They dumped a lot of money back into the markets and into people's pockets and companies' pockets to help stabilize things. It recovered over a couple of years. Back in the Great Depression, the governments did nothing. That's why we saw a very protracted 10-year depression in the markets there. Recent history then is indicating to us that governments are quicker to step in with some bailouts and actually help stabilize and help economies recover. So to me, that's a sign that markets are a little bit less risky now than they have been in the past, and recoveries do tend to be quicker. It's not about trying to either also time the markets and try to pick when things are going up quickly. It's really about how much time you spend in the market. So the trick with investing in the stock market is you buy and hold, buy and hold, buy and hold. You only take your money out when you need to in retirement. That's the winning ticket. Okay, how do you buy the whole entire world in stock markets? That sounds complicated. It's actually not. Again, nowadays with technology and equity traded funds or index funds, it's very simple. You have to open an investment account through your bank or through a low-cost online brokerage such as Questrade. You can open an RSP account, a TFSA account, or simply an investing account. But if you don't have those registered accounts, that's the way to go because there's huge tax savings as well. The best approach, again, based on the research, says that we want to own a well-balanced and diversified piece of the entire world's stock markets with a slight home country bias or tilt. So for Canadians, we'd want to own about 25 or 30% of Canadian markets and have the rest diversified around the globe in a proportion that's representative of how big those markets are. So for example, the US market makes up about half of the global stock markets. You'd want about half of that money in the US markets. You also want to have an appropriate mix of stocks and bonds. We talked about that. Once you get into your late 40s and into your 50s, there's wisdom in changing the ratio of your stocks versus bond holdings. There's other factors that come into play there. In addition to your age, it's when do you plan to retire? What are some of your hopes or things you want to do in retirement? Also depends if you have a pension, because for those people who have a pension, that's the equivalent of having fixed income. You can afford to have a higher risk tolerance if you know you have a pension coming. Anyways, there are online questionnaires that can help you determine what might be an appropriate risk tolerance for you. And I'll give you an example. Some people say, yes, I have an 80-20 portfolio. So what that means is that 80% of their holdings are in equities or various stock products, and 20% are in bonds or fixed income products. If you're under 45, you can probably take the risk of being 100% in equities. And again, here's just a very generic formula. As you get into your 50s, you might want to shift to an 80-20 ratio. And as we get closer to retirement, sometimes 60-40. But again, lots of factors are involved there. So you probably want to talk to someone and figure this out and what's more appropriate for you as an individual. Stick to a smart plan. Evidence-based, you want to buy regularly. You want to ignore the noise. Never sell in a panic. This past spring, when markets dropped over 30%, I saw a lot of people saying, when is it going to bottom out? I'm going to sell everything and wait on the sidelines in cash, and then I'll buy in when things settle down. Well, what happened was markets bottomed on March 23rd, and then the next 2 months, markets increased over 40%. It caught everybody off guard, including all the mutual fund managers in Canada. People sat in cash. They missed the best 2 months we've ever seen in the stock market. For those people that relaxed and just didn't do anything, they had a great year. In fact, the returns last year were over 10% if they had a broad-based, globally diversified ETF. It was an awesome year, very volatile, but they stuck out the panic part and they won in the end. What should you invest in? A couple of years ago in Canada, a couple companies came out with what I call all-in-one ETFs. They are self-balancing, which means if you have an 80-20 equity to fixed income mix, they take care of making sure it stays at that ratio. They are low cost and quite amazing products. It follows that they are evidence-based and they are therefore what I call a smart investing strategy. Two of those big companies are Vanguard and iShares. And I'm just going to give you an example of a couple of those products to help explain them. So Vanguard has one called VBAL, V-B-A-L. That's its ticker symbol. And again, you could go on and purchase that ticker symbol and own shares in all these companies that they have within their equity traded fund. It has a 60% equity, 40% bond ratio. They also have one called VGROW. It's an 80-20 mix. And they have another one called VEQT for equity. That's a 100% equity. Within these ETFs, they own over 12,500 globally diversified stocks. They're tilted to hold about 30% of the Canadian companies. They're extremely large, well over $1 billion of assets in each of these funds. And this is a great and simple way. With one product, you can own the whole world's stock markets. How did they do in 2020, even with all the COVID crash? The balanced portfolio returned 10.2%. The growth one did 10.8%. And again, the 100% equity one performed a little higher, 11.2%. That's a fantastic year in terms of stock market returns. Financial advisors, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Just to be aware, financial advisor is not a regulated term. A lot of the financial advisors that you would meet at the bank when you go in have taken a weekend course or two and are actually only licensed to sell you mutual funds. And remember, we talked about mutual funds. Very high fees. Fees matter significantly over the long term. And 90% of the mutual funds you buy will perform worse than the market average. The vast majority of financial advisors in Canada also have a conflict of interest. You need to be aware of that. They make money off of what they sell you. They either work on a commission base or they get a percentage of what your investment portfolio is worth. Please don't be afraid to ask questions when you go in. A good financial advisor is very open about how they are compensated for the work they do. Feel free to ask them, what are the certifications you have? What are you actually licensed to sell me in terms of financial products? How do you get paid? What is your fee structure like? And what are the fees associated with what I'm purchasing from you? Those are critical questions to ask. If you want an advisor, try to also seek one out that has what's called a fiduciary standard. So fiduciary is just a technical term that means they have a duty to you to do what is in your best interest. They're taking care of your money. It's not their self-interests that are primary, it's your interests that should be primary. There is a designation called a certified financial planner. It's an international designation, and they have what is called a fiduciary standard. They are held accountable to that. So that's a great designation to look for. There are certainly benefits to having a financial advisor. The biggest benefit is often they are a coach or a counselor. And the other thing is they should look at not only your investments, but your whole wealth picture. And what I mean by that is they'll help you take care of the investment component of your life, but they'll also talk to you about insurances, mortgages. What are your life goals, life situations? What's your retirement plan, your family situation? Maybe they help you discuss estate planning. They really should take a real global perspective with your whole wealth picture. The flip side is if you're able to be a smart investor and not get scared away with the ups and downs that a stock market goes through, do-it-yourself investing is, again, extremely easy nowadays and also very cost-effective. There is another option that's increasing in popularity now and gaining traction that sort of fits into the middle. Some advisors are working on a fee-for-service basis. So basically what you do is you go in, you meet with this type of advisor, you pay them a flat fee. So there's no conflict of interest. They're not going to provide you with biased information because they don't care what you purchase ultimately. They're getting paid with a one-time fee from you. So they will give you what's in your best interest. It's not inexpensive. You'll probably pay between $1,000 and $2,000 to get a full financial plan from them. But oftentimes that plan could be good for 5 or 10 years. And remember, when you lose $200,000 or more on your mutual fund portfolio, all of a sudden $1,000 or $2,000 for a sound mutual or for a sound financial plan doesn't sound that expensive. So fee-for-service advisors is also a great way to go. Okay, let's wrap it up. On my final point, pay it forward. Be happy, be joyful in your life. We have a great culture here at Comox Fire Rescue of paying it forward. So thank you to all of those in leadership here who help cultivate that experience. It's been fantastic. Who knows, maybe you'll be the next millionaire. So please don't forget to pay it forward. Studies have shown one of the greatest contributors to our own personal happiness is actually being generous. We tend to reap what we sow. And having talked about money here for the last hour, keep in mind there's other types of capital in our lives. It's not all about financial capital. And in fact, we know financial capital is not the most important thing in our lives. Financial capital is great, but what it really allows you to do is creates more time for you to enjoy the other more important ones. The other types of capital are relational capital, time capital, social capital, vocational capital. So if you're a smart investor and you can move forward in your life comfortably with your whole wealth picture, you'll be able to enjoy a lot of those other things more as you get on in your working career and into your retirement years. Our take home, so just a reminder, credit cards, the goal is to try and pay those off monthly because they are so expensive, the interest rates on them. Start a budget. If you've never tried it, have a look at where your discretionary spending is going. You might be surprised what 2 or 3 months worth of information will give you. Insurance. Think of insurance as being insured for the big unexpected events in your life, especially for your family if you have a partner or kids. Buying versus renting. Renting is not throwing your money away if you're strategic about it. Savings and pension plans. 63% of us do not have a pension plan of any sort. You need to create your own. Pay yourself first. Start off with $50 a month. Hopefully you can work your way up to 10%. And there's times in your life when that's not possible. You start having kids and life gets very expensive. But if you can be consistent over the long term, you'll do very, very well. We talked about the magic of time, of compounding gains. Start now. You want time to be on your side. So the sooner you get going, the better. Avoid taxes. There's great registered accounts that can help you avoid or delay paying taxes. Make use of those awesome accounts that the government's provided for us. We talked about investing your money. What should you invest it in? ETFs. That's your best bet. That's what all the evidence points to as being consistently the greatest and safest way to grow your money over time. Stay invested. Ignore the ups and downs. Take a long-term picture. Buy the whole world. Be a smart, diversified investor. And fees, yes, they do really matter. Buy low-cost ETFs. If you have any mutual funds in your portfolio, you need to seriously think about getting out of those and getting into better low-cost equity-traded funds. Financial advisors. Do you need one? Yes, you might. Make sure you get a good one who has your best interest at heart. Ask questions. Be aware of the conflict of interest that most financial advisors do have. And finally, pay it forward, be happy. I'm happy to take some questions in a moment, but I'll also pop up a screenshot here of some of my favorite resources, a couple of excellent books, a great podcast that I listen to called The Rational Reminder if you want to dig a little deeper. And there's a great website called the Canadian Couch Potato. If you find them online and go to their Getting Started page, they have a great synopsis of why investing in ETFs or index funds beats the market and why it's a great way to go. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. And again, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about any of these things. And if you have any questions, I love talking about this stuff. Hope you enjoyed it and have a good evening. Thank you.